Hello. Is the sound okay? Okay. So, thank everybody. You guys can come over, you can stay there if you want, whatever you like. You can ignore me. But thank you folks for showing up. My name is Matt Marquardt, Matthew, and this is Richard Otarovich. I think some of you probably know Richard. But anyway, a few years ago we started a group called Catholic Conscience with the idea that two things, I think. First is that, as should be becoming apparent here recently, the political process is kind of winding away from real values that I think most people would consider appropriate. The governments are not listening to people. They tend to be driving people apart into corners rather than trying to gather them together and do productive things. And so we think that there is a need actually to, Father, did you want to say a word or two first? No? Okay. So we felt that there was actually a need to try to bring the political conversation certainly in Canada, North America, and democracies, back towards gospel-type values. And the other possible criticism we saw is that we saw that Catholics were very often being manipulated on the basis of one or two important issues, but you could basically get a mass murderer to run for office, and he would say, I'm against this or I'm for this, and Catholics would kind of just vote for him because it is important, even though it's not the only thing, right? And so we thought it would help if we were able to broaden the conversation to all of the social teachings of the church, and at the same time bring the whole political conversation a bit closer to it. And just to be clear, we never ever take positions on candidates, we don't endorse people, and we're not actually endorsed by the Archdiocese or any other official church group, although we get a lot of encouragement. We're independent. And we're here tonight because in recent months, there seems to be a trend of kind of snipping away at the rights and the values taught by the church, by the Catholic Church specifically, by Christian churches, and really any organization that is of a good conscience, right? I mean, like I said, I think you see that political parties are tending to drive people apart. If you listen to political speeches these days, the candidates very seldom talk about kind of a holistic platform, a thing that's good for the country, a vision that's good for the country. They tend to talk about tiny little things that are hot button issues. And they try to get, if you listen to the content, it basically boils down to what do we have to do to get people to vote for us? And then once we get elected, what do we have to do to stay in office? And they do whatever they have to stay in office rather than looking at a larger picture and steering us towards something that may be good for all of us. We've seen this in the issue of conscience rights of healthcare professionals and others who are told that they have to make referrals for assisted suicide, whether we think it's appropriate or not. Very recently, a year or two ago, before the last federal elections, the Prime Minister actually said that nobody could stand for offices in his party if they were pro-life. Very recently, there was this new initiative to deny faith-based groups jobs funding for summer students if they had as part of their objective to be pro-life or promote other values. There are educational issues where probably inappropriate things are being taught to second graders who are sorting out the difference between me and the world and everything else rather than possibly what sexual orientation I have. And then recently too, there's a trend. I've been talking to a number of churches and offices to the Archdiocese and non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations that would correspond with their elected officials, their representatives, and used to get responses from them. With Pax Christi, we got lovely responses from people like Christia Freeland and the Minister of the Environment and other people. But I've heard from a number of sources now that very recently the responses have ceased. If it's coming from a Catholic source, there just is no response. And actually tonight, we're all supposed to be over at the University of St. Michael's College having an all candidates meeting with the leaders of the parties that are standing for provincial election. And the only party that would commit to coming to that or even basically bother to respond was the Green Party. All the other parties just refused to talk to us. And I thought at first that maybe that was because of the timing. Father and I talked about the timing of that meeting in light of the timing for the election, and we thought that right now is a good time to do it before everybody gets into reading week and is distracted with possibly more pressing matters. But then I saw a news article that said all of the party leaders, except for Doug Ford, agreed to appear last night at a similar meeting for African Canadians. So I thought it was very curious that just no response at all, because we've done all candidate meetings for several years now. We typically get a very good response. So I think that something is up. And we saw it in the last federal elections too. The Conservative Party, we were running all candidate elections at several parishes around the GTA. And initially, we were getting a very good response from conservative candidates. But at some point, and this was not just aimed at the church, this was everybody, but at some point, the Prime Minister then said, you're not allowed to talk at these things. I will do all the speaking for this party. Just back out. And so suddenly we started getting all these letters where people remember they had other appointments and conflicts they couldn't defeat and things like that, and they all drew out. So I think there's a concern potentially that the government is not listening to all of the people it's supposed to represent and not engaging with us. And so the question arises, how is we as Christians and as Catholics supposed to respond? And I have found over the years that there are a number of groups, and particularly if you talk to some of the evangelical groups and some of the Protestant groups, they will actually tell you that you're not supposed to engage in society. You're just supposed to just deal with each other in your own church and not engage, not vote, because the devil runs the world and all the offices are corrupt. And they base that basically on Christ going out into the desert to withdraw from the world. But it's our view that, and the view of the church actually, that the opposite is true. That as Catholics, having read the New Testament all the way through, that we're actually called to participate in particularly in a democracy where we can speak up. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but this book is called The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's written by a pontifical office, the Vatican Office for Justice and Peace, and it basically goes through all of the encyclicals, the New Testament, and everything else, and pulls together all of Catholic social thought. It's pretty comprehensive. It's a very interesting book. It's not really a sit down and read it from cover to cover, but it's a great reference book. And they speak about the duty to participate, and I'll just read this. It says, participation in community life is one of the pillars of all democratic orders. It is clearly evident that every democracy has to be participative. This means that different subjects of civil community at every level must be informed and listened to and involved. And that's just obvious, I think. Everybody has to participate. We're given the power to govern ourselves, and that includes not only what we as individuals are allowed to do in the broader society, but also how other people in society are treated. Some of the less advantaged people they may not be capable of voting, of understanding the issues, but we're still responsible for them in a democracy. So we have to speak up. The Catechism of the Catholic Church actually mentions the duty to participate. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops has put out materials, and the Ontario Assembly of Bishops has. And responding to some of maybe the evangelical or groups that say that we're not supposed to participate, if you actually go through the New Testament, you'll see that Christ speaks of going out to all the nations. He speaks very much of interacting with others, even the Good Samaritan. And in the chapter 25 of Matthew, remember that I'm sure we're all familiar with the parable of the judgment of the nations. We hear it in church every 3 years, right? About how the world at the end will come together before Christ, and Christ will say, you people did a great job. You fed me when I was hungry, and you clothed me when I was naked, and you took care of me when I was sick or in prison. And they say, well, when was that? And he says, every time you did it to the least of my brothers, you did it to me. And then he tells the other half, you people didn't do this, and that's not a good thing. But that parable is not directed to individuals. It says when he comes in glory, all the nations will be assembled before him, And he will say to the nations, he will separate them based on what they did. So I think that's a very clear message that, at some level, being citizens of a democracy where we have a right to speak up, at the end, when we stand before Christ and defend ourselves, we're going to be called to account for what we did or didn't do with the right that we have to have an influence on society. Closer to home, the Ontario Assembly of Catholic Bishops has pointed out that it is, basically it's we who choose governments and give them power to shape community. We need to pause and consider how fortunate we are. There are still too many places where that's not true, and that's very true in many parts of the world. And we have to take responsibility for the outcomes. And it actually says it's inconceivable that people would consciously decide not to vote. Now, one of the things I was getting at earlier, I think, is that certainly in Canada and other places, I think that we're becoming maybe too much party oriented and maybe too much manipulated by media, which is very cheap and easy and pervasive. And so the duty actually has to run a little bit deeper than just voting. Because I'm sure everybody has had the experience that you go to the polls on election day and you look at this list of candidates and say, boy, it's not a question of who I want, it's which of these people will do the least amount of damage, right? Which one, is there any hope at all? And a lot of people actually just refuse to vote on that basis. And that's not responsible. We have to get involved, and if waiting until we only have a restricted set of choices in the election booth is not working, then we have to get involved earlier. There's nothing that says that Catholics can't be members of political parties. Catholic conscience here, we are staying entirely neutral. But all of us as individuals, if we feel aligned with an identifiable platform or one of the parties, we should join it. And we should go to the conventions, we should speak up, and we should speak for the candidates that we think have the better values. Having run a number of these candidate meetings, I've seen that they're actually astonishingly good people running for office. Some of these people are highly intelligent and I think very sincerely motivated. Now, they don't always seem to make it to the top. They don't always seem to get nominations, but there are wonderful people putting their names forward. And I think that if more people got involved at that level, we might be able to shift the quality of the candidates we're getting. Richard's going to talk about this in a bit, I think. He's actually actively involved in that. So, in being involved, we have to actually be involved at a much deeper level. We have to witness every day, just everything we do as Catholics, right? We can't be identified as Catholics and out, and Lisa's looking at me because I struggle with this every day on the sidewalk, right? There are rude people on the sidewalk, and I have a very deep sense of justice, and I wish that people would pay attention to where they're walking the sidewalk. But I have to be careful because I am an identifiable Catholic, and I can't be telling people what actually is in my heart at that moment. I have to stop and think about it. We have to witness joyfully. When we're in the office, people know whether we're Catholic, whether we go to church. I have found, and I think Lisa has found, that at the office we're known to be Catholics and happy Catholics, and people come to us that you wouldn't think and ask you questions sometimes. They kind of wait for a quiet moment. They'll come and ask you, why do you guys do this? Or why do you do that? Or, gee, I have this problem. What should I do about that? It's actually kind of astonishing. And I find actually, we're both lawyers, and I find that, we get in negotiations with other lawyers quite a bit. And lawyers can be very aggressive, but I find that being known as a happy and devoted Catholic, just being involved in the conversation sometimes can change the nature of that conversation. I'll go to partner meetings and that I know have been contentious, and the tone of it will change when I show up. So that's not a bad thing. People know who we are, and we have to live that way. We have to speak out too, but always in confidence and joy and love. I think most religious groups are kind of famous for getting a little righteous sometimes, right? And kind of pointing fingers at people and telling them what to do and what not to do. And there's a place for that, but I think that for the most part, Christians can distinguish themselves by speaking out with love and with a love of voice and mercy. Pope Francis tells us about this quite a lot. If you read documents like The Joy of the Gospel, he points out that we're going to get a lot further if we just talk to people in a nice way and lead them rather than trying to browbeat them into submission. We also have to get involved in non-governmental social organizations, nonprofits that speak up on things. And like I said earlier, we need to get involved in parties. We'll talk about that a bit more. But before we talk about some of the details of ways we can be involved, I wanted to talk about the framework that the church sets out for participation. It's really quite comprehensive. You can basically put all questions into it at one level or another. And actually, it's a good thing to have right here in your heart because it can actually guide your life. It's really, being Christian, I think, has a social element no matter how you slice it. I'm sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. But the Compendium is one of the main sources of the framework. It was published by the Pontifical Council for Justice Peace several years ago under St. John Paul II. And it draws on, like I said, the gospel, the encyclicals, all these things. And it breaks down Catholic social thought into a number of permanent principles and a number of fundamental values. You can see them here. The principles are, it doesn't actually talk very much about good stewardship, but if you read through it, it's a constant theme. It's an overarching theme. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The dignity of the human person, which basically touches on every aspect of life. It's really the center of the reason that we're here and what we should be doing with our lives, both individually and collectively. The common good, which I think we all understand. There are things that certainly are in the common interest. Subsidiarity, which is a little bit tougher. We'll talk about that one too, but it's an important principle. I think particularly we're seeing effects of this. Too much of the world is being driven by very few people here recently. There are a number of books about this. The United Nations talks about it. We have to be very careful about giving too much power to too few people. All decisions should be driven down. Solidarity, I think, is pretty easy to understand. It kind of stems from the dignity of the human person. It's the principle basically that no human being is worth more than any other human being. We're all in the same boat, we're all in the same earth, we're all headed for the same destiny. And Christ will be a lot happier with us when we get to the end if we've tried to work together and help each other out. Because we've not all been put in the same starting place, right? And then the values that lie behind these things are things like truth and freedom and justice and love. And these values obviously are taken directly from the gospel. I can talk about this for a while I like, but the first social set of commands from God is the Ten Commandments. He kind of puts everything in order. The first commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And then there are several developments at that point. And then we get into things like you shall not kill, which is the fifth commandment, and obviously essential. It's not a long commandment. It doesn't have a lot of qualifiers. It says you won't kill. That's something we need to bear in mind. And then honor your father and mother. Take care of the people around you. Don't covet things that God didn't give to you and what your neighbor might have. It doesn't matter to you. God put us all in different positions to see what we do with it, right? But then, over time, if you read through the New Testament, you'll see that as humans do, we kind of got off track. We started getting a little bit overly focused on rules. I think every religion, by definition, has an aspect of defining the relationship of the individual to God. That's just the definition of religion, right? We're trying to figure out who God is and how we relate to Him, how we get closer to God. But the thing that distinguishes the Christian religion is that Christ told us, there's the parable where it's in all four of the Gospels in one way or the other. But one of the Sadducees or one of the lawyers asked him, Master, what is the greatest commandment? And Christ goes right back to the first commandment, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. But he also said, the second one is like it. You will love your neighbor as yourself. Now that's not in the Ten Commandments. I think it's probably inferable from the Ten Commandments, but it's not there explicitly. He said, this is the whole law and the prophets. Love God and do that by taking care of your neighbor. And then he explains some more in chapter 25 of Matthew. He said, for social thought, chapter 25 is really, I think, central. Anybody that's not read it ought to consider it. The middle part is the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins who kind of fritter away their time and their resources because they think that they won't be called to answer anytime soon. And then the master shows up and they're not ready for it. And then, having warned us of that, Christ talks about the parable of the talents, which basically goes back to some solidarity and some other things, because we're all put in different positions. We all at birth, basically. We all have different levels of intelligence. We have different levels of physical strength and ability. We're born in different parts of the world at different times in history to different parents. We're all given different sets of circumstances, but the whole point is that we're put in this life to see what we do with those for God's purpose. And at the end of this life, we're going to be called to answer for what we did with these things, and we're expected to bring back the talents that were lent to us and explain how we used them for good and made them better and improved them, increased them. So, getting into the permanent principles there of the compendium that we talked about, the first one was the dignity of the human person. It's important to understand, I think, that the dignity of the human person is given to us at the moment of our conception. If you recall, chapter 1 of Genesis points out that we are all made in the image and likeness of God. Now, no conceived human being has ever been the same as any other one. That's just a scientific fact based on DNA that works. And everybody's born a little bit different. But we are all made in the image and the likeness of God. And we're all just different impressions. But every one of them is an equal impression of God. There is no greater value to one than the other. We're all part of God's creation. And that is a very great gift. That puts us kind of in God's family. We're a bit like God, and as we go through this life, the purpose is to increase our likeness to God, to seek God, find out more about God, to make ourselves better people and a little bit more like God. So anything that we do, either as individuals or as a society, that restricts or hampers us in that effort to find God, to make ourselves more like God, to help others be more like God, diminishes our dignity and handicaps others. So there's a wide range of topics that come up and can be considered through this lens of the dignity of the human person. The first is, obviously, the one that comes up most often is the right to life. And you probably heard the expression that over the last several years certainly has become more prominent, from conception to natural death. And I think that's because, like I mentioned a minute ago, from the moment of conception, every individual human being is unique. There's never been one like it and will never be one again. And then every moment of that individual's life is an opportunity for that person, either alone or in company with others, to try to find their way closer to God, to learn more about God. We don't think about that sometimes from one day to the next, but that's actually what we're supposed to be doing here. And so anything we do to deprive a person of life or the ability to use their gifts for God's purposes is an affront to their dignity. And certainly, things like encouraging people to terminate their lives early probably falls in that category. And that comes up in a lot of ways. One of the ways is, the part of the debate, and I'm not going to get far into this because I'm not taking sides, but part of the debate goes into, well, these people are in insufferable pain and there are no care facilities for them. So in the coming provincial elections, for example, one of the points is that there's some thought that possibly the provinces are encouraging people to opt for an early out because it's cheaper on the medical effort costs a lot less money. It comes to an end a lot earlier. And if you look at it, actually, there is something like 30% fewer beds required in Ontario for hospice care than there ought to be for a population this size. And I don't know that as a nation, as a society, that's something we want to answer for. We have the resources, we have the wherewithal to provide hospice services for people who want to live out their lives as God intended it. God created life. God can and should determine when it ends. It's not up to us to make that that decision. It also gets into issues about nurturing the family, which goes to a lot of different things. It's about the availability of good jobs. It's about proper education. It's about making sure that different social, economic groups, races are not discriminated against. We need to provide a world where everybody is allowed to participate equally and where the family unit, which is obviously central to creation, honor your father and mother, is allowed to flourish. The common good is obviously a hugely important principle for anybody going into elections. And different elections affect different levels of government, obviously. Like we're doing the provincial elections here in a few months. Next year we're going to have federal elections. And the duties and the obligations of the different levels of government are different. And that's part of that goes into subsidiarity. We'll talk about it in a minute. But there are elements of life that we have to share. We all breathe the same air. Ultimately, we all drink the same water. Probably everybody's entitled enough room to grow crops so they can eat and have a place to live and have materials to make a house out of. Even in our modern world, there are elements of finance that really affect the entire world, that we need to think about how, everybody needs to have access to ways of having a dignified life and a proper life that allows them to focus on getting back to God. Ownership of property, there are different theories for ownership of property. Some are more or less consistent with Christianity. Peace and governments, obviously everybody has an interest in peace. Lives are very often terminated and property destroyed by conflict, which is almost always just inappropriate. And then we have a duty to participate in society. And then subsidiarity. This is one that people stumble on a lot. They don't understand why it's important and why it's one of the permanent principles. It's because when you concentrate too much power in too few people, you begin to lose voices. I think maybe we see this as it's akin to the phenomenon we're seeing with political parties in most democracies right now, where the party doesn't even listen to its own members in parliament. The party just says, this is the line, you stick to it or you're no longer in this caucus. It doesn't listen to people, the groups, faith groups or other groups that want to speak out, that think that, maybe that's not a great idea, we should talk about that. And so the more concentrated the power is, the less able one is to have an effect, to maybe, as things change or different requirements come up, or as people point out needs, the less difficult it might be to get those changed. And so the principle is that you want decisions to be made at the lowest level possible. And if we look at some of these issues that relate to the common good, you can see how that works out. The environment's the first one. There are certainly aspects of environmental issues that need to be decided at a global level. I think very soon, it's already started, but very soon we're going to see people like the United States and China and Canada arguing about who has the right to put carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. Canada right now is digging up large parts of northern Alberta and Saskatchewan and trying to make oil out of asphalt. And that results in a lot of greenhouse gases. Now, sure, that's happening in Canada, but that's going to affect people generations from now in other parts of the world. And so it's in our interest to do that. It costs us less. We're not paying the cost of cleaning that up in 100 years on the other side of the world. And so it's in our economic interest to do that, but it would be, I think, a good idea if all voices in the world had a voice. It's probably appropriate for all voices in the world to have a voice in what happens, or to what extent that's allowed. I think it might be different if this was happening, say, in China or Australia. Canadians might be quite upset. What are you people doing over there? You can't do that. And they say, well, we're in our own country, we can do this. On the other hand, if the corner gas station had a rupture in one of its gas tanks and that tank needs to be taken out and the soil cleaned up, you don't necessarily need the United Nations to be involved in that. And maybe it's better if it's not, because maybe somebody will come up, the United Nations might focus on one very inefficient way of cleaning that up, and somebody else over there in California might think of a much better way. So it's good to have these percolating ideas, right? Ideas and issues should be decided at the level that's appropriate to them and no higher. Does that kind of make sense? I got to apologize. I meant to tell at the start that anytime I give these talks, it's not meant to be just a lecture. So we're going to certainly open up for conversation in a little bit, but if there are questions along the way, please feel free. Like, if this is not quite clear, let me know. Are we doing okay? Okay. So solidarity is the last of the permanent principles. I think that's a pretty easy one to understand. It's been used, I think, actually for good effect, and certainly in my lifetime since the fall of communism. There was the Polish group Solidarity that Pope John Paul II actually had a voice in. But I love this picture with the Catholic priest and the Baptist minister there that may be familiar to you, kind of standing together, saying, look, we're all people, we're all God's creatures, we're all God's children, we should be standing together. And you can actually find a root for that in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, the question at the end of that is, which of these was the man's neighbor? Like, I don't know how much you know about the history behind it, but Samaritans and Jews actually were very closely related. They're all part of the 12 tribes of Israel. But they got into their little divisions, This is part of the reason Christ showed up, to start saying that these people are your neighbors, right? That's what I'm talking about. It's not just the person who lives next door to you that goes to the same synagogue. All of these people are your neighbors. Your neighbor's whoever needs help, and he says, which of these was the man's neighbor, right? Now, I just put this in here because this is actually probably a bit more traditional way of describing the principles of Catholic social thought. This comes out for a long time of thinking. And you'll see that a lot of the same issues in there are divided up a little bit differently. It doesn't really matter very much. I stick with this one because that's what the Compendium says, and I want to be sure that I'm not straying too far from the teachings of the church. But they all go kind of the same way. But if you see this, it all kind of boils down to the same way. So, the idea then is that we're supposed to take all of these principles and think about our own life and the lives of those around us, in our national life and our international life, and think about the gifts that God has given us and how we put those to use when we make decisions. We all make decisions all day, every day, from the time we get out of bed, right, until the time we go back to bed. It's all decisions. And that's the framework we're supposed to use. But so now in a situation where you've got governments and political parties that maybe are not serving the best interests of the people, but maybe starting to serve their own interests, how do we, as Catholics, with this framework, respond to that? Did you want to talk, or you want me to keep talking and you're going to speak up?
You can keep speaking.
Okay. So, I think the basic way we approach this is, it's a kind of a continuous cycle. We have to stay informed. We actually have a Christian duty to stay informed of what's happening to our neighbor. We can't help our neighbor if we don't know what's happening to our neighbor. And we have to be careful. We'll talk about this in a minute, but I'm sure you all know that, it's very easy to get information on your cell phone these days. Now, whether that information is worth listening to and taking action on is a different question. And as people facing Congress right now are trying to explain that can be abused. We have to witness, like I said earlier. We have to be involved. We have to pray, certainly, if we're going to call ourselves Christians, and we need to call on God. We can't do everything ourselves, right? We can't, as individuals, probably prevent all the wars and all the injustice in the world. We need help from God with that. We do have to vote. We have to stay in touch with those that we elect once they've been elected, and we just have to keep cycling it. We can never, you can't relax, right? It's living in the world and being a member of democracy means you have to pay attention from one day to the next. So, informing ourselves is becoming increasingly important. In the old days, you subscribed to a newspaper, and most of the newspapers took pride in reporting things responsibly. There's always been abuses. There's been newspapers that are better than other newspapers. Like if you look through history of the last 100 years, there are dime magazines and kind of silly things that are silly. But the point is that we have to identify and consult responsible news sources. You have to go back to the source. And we have to support them too. It's very easy to get free news. It's almost as good as the real news. But I'm sure you all have noticed by now that every time you touch your computer screen or every time you touch a key on this, somebody's watching it. If you're connected to the internet, somebody knows exactly what you're doing. They know exactly what part of the screen you're looking at. And they're going to keep that data and use it to try to sell you things or to do things to control your world and the world, to get something out of it. So we have to be very careful how we consume news, how we approach news. And really, I think the only safe thing we can do is try to identify and support responsible news sources. I subscribe to several newspapers. I don't get time to read them all, but I think just paying them to keep doing their work helps them. They have to pay reporters and publish things. We have to talk with each other. I learn a lot of things from talking to other people. I get new points of view that I haven't thought of before. And maybe occasionally I help somebody else understand something. And we all have to listen. There's way too much talking in the world, like I'm doing now, and not enough listening. You guys are doing great. I think I talked about this already a bit. We have to witness everywhere all the time. It's not always easy, but we have to try to do it, and we have to aim always for witnessing with great love and mercy. One of the ways this has come out, if you go to our website, Catholic Conscience, you'll see a piece that I wrote. we try to post links to news stories that we think are relevant, and we tie them back to candidates and parties. It's a relatively small thing now, but it's starting to grow. But the idea of the website was that sometimes it's difficult when you get to election time to figure out what candidates really think and what they really do. And we thought that if we built a database of links to news articles, you can look up and see how this member of parliament actually votes, what this member of parliament said 4 years ago, and what they've done in the meantime. And so somebody wanted to post an editorial piece about abortion and how the Catholic Church is wrong and its position on abortion. So I looked at it. Has anybody here ever heard of Michael Koren? Yeah. Okay. And Michael Koren was a convert to the Catholic Church, a very intelligent man. And he was, for quite a while, a very passionate and prolific Catholic author. Well, he had written an article, this editorial piece, describing how wrong the Catholic Church is about abortion. And I thought, well, that's odd, because I have right here a book called Why the Catholic Church is Right, written by the same individual 6 years ago. And it has a chapter on abortion in it. And so I took the editorial, modified it, and said, gee, let's look at this issue, because you can see how people can manipulate the different sides they're on, right? And kind of talked about things like the Fifth Commandment. And, you know, it's just, I don't think there's any way you can justify abortion in almost any circumstance. It can be very difficult, very challenging sometimes, but part of the circumstances God gives us to see what we do with is things like unwanted births. How do we as a society respond to that? Are we providing support for mothers who are pregnant with children they don't want? Are we providing support for fathers who may be stuck with children they don't want? Are we helping them get through this process and find loving homes for children that are not wanted? Or are we kind of just saying, no, that's your problem, you fix that, but you can't have an abortion? We have to look at what we're doing as a society and come up with a solution that actually works in love and mercy, right? And I think that this was one of Pope Francis's early points, that judgment is for Christ. It's not really for up to us to be judgmental about it. We do have to judge. We have to decide whether ideas are right and wrong, what we can do about them, but we're not really supposed to be judging other individuals, you know, until we've walked a mile in their moccasins and have lived their lives, because they've been given different circumstances. We have to involve ourselves. For those who are interested, Catholic Conscience is looking for volunteers in a lot of ways. Actually, these things that I'm rolling up here are little information sheets that are on the table back there that kind of say what we do, and we're happy to have people involved, but there's all sorts of ways. There are pro-life groups, there are animal rights groups, there are equal advocacy groups, there are anti-discriminatory groups, there are all sorts of groups, and many of them are either Catholic or entirely consistent with Catholic thought. You should think about getting involved with them, supporting them, helping them do their work. It's easy to do things voluntarily or even professionally these days. Social media, there's ways to get involved in that, like maybe not, certainly not getting involved in social media in negative ways, but also think about, you know, when you see things posted that maybe you're not leading the sheep closer towards Christ in a group, think about ways you can respond to that and get them moving. And then political parties, like I said, we should be involved. And you have some thoughts on this?
Yes.
Good. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Richard Jarvich. I'm a student here at the University of Toronto doing my master's. So I'd just like to speak to you on the importance of getting involved politically. So there's numerous ways to get involved. It doesn't have to be running at a level that's kind of intimidating, especially when we're younger. Not everyone can be Sam Moosterhoff. However, there are different ways. Like a great way to get started is joining a campus club. We have one here at the university for all the parties. Not only that, but in your riding, when you go back home, wherever it may be, or even here in Toronto, there are youth associations where people can get involved, and you can really work on building that network, meeting new people, communicating, and being introduced to great opportunities to get more involved, whether it's on a campaign, whether it's joining some sort of association within your party. The opportunities are endless, so those are things that I really and strongly advocate for. Myself, I started off as a volunteer. I was able to get into Queen's Park, and then from there go into a campus club, now beyond the executive of one of the campus clubs, and also join the association. So it goes to show you that you're able to work and also bring in other people and influence them. So if there are certain issues that you're very passionate about, then find a party that is most closely related to yours. That way you'll have an easier way of pitching it to them and getting people of like-mindedness to join. And a lot of the parties now really focus on the grassroots level of what do people want and how will it get them out to vote. So if you are able to organize enough people together, then you can bring that issue up. And once that issue is heard and they see that there's mobilization for voters, then it can go up. One of the issues we actually saw in the past federal election where marijuana was brought up. That was brought up by their youth association, the Liberals, and that's what got all the young people out to vote. So we saw it last federal election, that these kind of things are very important. So for things that we are passionate about, such as the pro-life movement, conscious decision of doctors, these are things that if we are able to work together and get involved and have proper representatives through the youth associations or regular associations brought up to our candidates, and also helping out those candidates so they win the nominations and can speak for us, then we are able to achieve the goals that we desire to see.
I've had experiences in meetings. I wonder if you've experienced something like this. But I've been in meetings many times where maybe there's half a dozen people talking about how to make it or what decisions should be made in a certain set of circumstances, and the group will be being led by one individual in a direction. And then a quieter individual on the other side of the table will speak up, but what about this? Have we thought about this? And one individual can speak up and shift the entire group, sometimes in very short orders. And that meeting can turn about 90 or 180 degrees and come out with a very different response. And I think that people like you, taking part in those conversations can have an effect. Not every time, not all the time, but sometimes, and sometimes when it's important. Have you had that kind of experience?
Yes, a lot of the time people will be very open to bringing in new perspectives. Parties always want to expand their membership and hear more of the voice so they can get more voters out there, as we've spoken about. And they don't want people just to hear, sign a survey or whatever, it gets into Queen Park. They show it in question period and that's the last of it. They actually want people to join their memberships, run for positions on their executives, and then bring the ideas. Once you get in, you can add additions to the agenda. Just call the president of your association and have it brought up and discuss it, and work not only with your candidate or MPP, but also with your riding association president. And I think it's very important to have those conversations and advocate for them. And not only just at the meeting, but to talk outside of the meeting as well. So it is something people are expecting and have time to think about, so there can be meaningful discussion.
And can somebody like us have an effect on which candidates are nominated?
Definitely. Right now in Mississauga Centre, I know for the PC party, there's multiple candidates that are running for the nomination, and it's up to the people to get involved, and whoever they align themselves with most, they can make a difference by supporting that candidate, buying the membership, getting people to buy the memberships as well, and going out there and canvassing, doing the phone calls to make sure this person is heard, as are their messages. Because that's, in the end, what people care about most, is the messages. People can have publicity money, but if they don't represent you, they don't care about you. But if they only know this person through the publicity and not the person who actually cares about those issues, then we'll fall into those issues on election day of who's going to do the least amount of damage, rather than who actually is going to advance the agenda and advocate the issues that are of importance to me.
Anybody else got any ideas about ways you can participate in society?
Many of the MPs have their own youth councils, and I'd recommend that it's underrepresented. The Catholics are not there.
Yep.
So you can
So not
call
gonna
your
listen to us.
MP, because it is an opportunity to tell them what you think.
Yeah,
It's like a time commitment of once a month.
One of the issues I actually found back in my writing was I went to the various churches and I spoke to the youth ministers and said, I'm starting this organization and I think it would be great. But people were intimidated because they don't want to go into that process. So I think that's actually one of the issues we need to take, or one of the things we need to focus on people care enough to go to the March for Life. However, they were hesitant to join a youth association and have their voices heard directly to the MP or MPP. So it's kind of those things where it's good to march in front of Queen's Park or in Ottawa, but it's another thing to be actively involved in those discussions and shaping the discussions that are held within the party at the grassroots levels with the youth.
And you know, I think any practicing Christian has a leg up in modern democracies, because if you look at any of the foundational documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whether they say they are or not, those documents are only possible because of Christianity. They were written by Christians, they came out of Christian philosophies. So you've got a leg up. The world is already, or is at this moment, aligned with real Christian values, or it says it is. And it seems to be drifting away into a place of money talks and everything else walks. But we still have an opportunity to speak up and call people back to the values that countries like this were founded on.
Yes.
I just want to say that sometimes people can feel very intimidated talking to politicians. They feel that, that they have some more power than we do. But my experience has been that when we do go and speak to them, they're delighted.
Yeah.
Because this is an opportunity for them to hear from their constituents what they really want. Whether or not they can actually follow through on what you want is a different story, but they feel that they fulfill part of their obligations as your representative because they're listening to you. So if a lot of people knew that, I think they'd be more ready to take the step to go visit their MP or MPP.
I'll just comment that I only ever had contact with politicians because of this, but I have found them actually astonishingly accessible and interested in listening. Now, I think when you get to the level of the party leaders and things like that, they maybe don't. But certainly your local elected representative is usually willing to listen. Father?
I was going to say that it can be intimidating also because you go and you feel like you're alone. There is Catholic conscience, but the Archdiocese had a whole sign-up Sunday, so we had it for 2 consecutive weeks. And it's important to not be a lone ranger. Don't just kind of go off on your own and then start to sending off emails or meeting with people, and then you're not well prepared. The diocese, headed by His Eminence Cardinal Collins, they work with lawyers, they work with all sorts of people, well-educated people, to come up with a strategy to be able to make presentations to the government and to the different leaders. So again, we're part of the body of Christ, and we have a good leader, and there's many people in the diocese that are working for that. And so we don't have to go on our own, but we have a responsibility to sign up and to follow through with what the Cardinal asks of us. Because they've already addressed a lot of these issues. So a lot of the work is done, the homework, but then we have to also kind of follow through with the requests that come.
Father, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. And actually, I have experience of the Office of Communications at the Archdiocese is what Father's talking about. Neil McCarthy there has given great thought to this, and if you want to speak up about something, you're wondering what the church is thinking about this, those people will help you cheerfully and very well. And I will invite anybody here who wants to check that out and is having trouble making the right connection. If you write to me, I will introduce you to Neil McCarthy, and he will help. He'll be delighted to do this. They actually train people, like Father said, they will call together groups of people and have media training about how to speak things about, and give you talking points. You can tell I don't always do great at it, but you probably have more ability than I have, and they will help you develop those abilities. Barbara?
No, yeah, I'm just thinking, I wonder how many politicians really understand the scope of the church's teaching on social justice. So much of it gets narrowed down to 1 or 2 issues,
Yes.
which get the press. And yet the teaching is so broad, you don't really get articles, at least I don't see them, about the option for the poor, or the oppression of people. I'm thinking recently of the minimum wage increase, and Tim Hortons Well, in the social justice teaching of the church, that's considered wrong,
Yes.
immoral. But that's not what politicians, I think there's a stereotype of the Catholic. The only things they're concerned about are abortion and, you know, and yet this, what we're talking about here, in terms of establishing the kingdom, following
Yes.
gospel values, is so much bigger. So how do we get that message across?
I think that's a great point. And it's only by actually being involved, because even if you take something like the minimum wage issue, that helps for a short period of time and can be critical, but it is not a long-term solution to anything. We need to look at the deeper problems of job availability, education availability, resources, homeless, all these things. We need to be looking at how to solve them. We have the power to solve them. Pope Francis has said several times, there is enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And so the resources exist. We can do these things if we get involved. But we have to start looking at longer term, larger level solutions rather than just, unfortunately, I think in most democracies, and certainly this one, we get a lot of little Band-Aid offerings in the months running up to elections that sound great, but maybe cause ultimately more problems than they actually solve. So involvement is really the only way.
And, you know, the candidate meetings that we had, that was an opportunity to inform candidates
Yes.
of the church, what we believe, what the church believes.
Yeah, that's actually one of the fundamental things we do at Catholic Conscience is we host all candidate meetings and we ask questions that are drawn from the social teachings of the church. We ask them in a very open-ended fashion to draw them out, but to guide them, like these are the things that Catholics care about. We don't know that we have all the answers, but we have a pretty good idea what questions we should be asking and what the goals should be, right? We don't necessarily know how to get there, but let's hear your thoughts on these things. And the candidates have actually responded very warmly to these things
Very well.
when they show up. I think you're going to say something.
No, I was just going to say, it's also important when hot button issues are brought up to look at whether it's just trying to replace one broken part in the system or if it's going to be a systemic change to see if it will actually solve the issue itself.
Yes.
So, such as the minimum wage thing, we see that there was immediate backlash to it and that it's not going to solve anything and continue things such as that. So I think it's really important to take time to read and look into it to see what the outcomes will be, and then find issues to advocate for proper change and bringing that up to the attention of your elected members.
So when we get to prayer, hopefully we don't have to add too much there, but I do want to remind you that it is hugely important. I have the personal experience that prayer is answered. And if enough of us pray, then we can get answers. And then don't forget to vote. And before voting, please don't forget to register. We talked about staying in touch pretty well, I think. So I'll just sum up by saying something I said earlier, that our only job in this life is to seek God with everything that God has given us, all the resources God has given us, and to help others. And we seek God not just by looking for ourselves, but trying to help those around us find God too, right? Because at some point we're going to be called to return these gifts with increase. And this is a particular formulation of this thought that I don't see talked about too much, but I like, these two are two of my favorite thoughts in the Bible. Christ, in very early in John, is talking to some of the disciples. He says, if we're all looking for eternal life, and it's good to know what we're looking for and how to get there, right? And so at the one point he says, eternal life is knowing God, the only God and the one he sent. But he says that eternal life is the knowledge of God. And then he says, if you remain in my word, you'll be truly my disciples and you will know the truth. So he's telling us clearly that this is our purpose and this is how to get to where we want to be, right? And then just to reiterate that when we allow things to interfere with our own path towards God or those of others, then we stunt people's growth. So, happy to have questions or conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about where would you recommend going to get reliable information about candidates prior to voting? Do you have any recommendations?
We're doing the best we can. What we're trying, I don't know if there is a single source. This is why actually we started this. We have some information on candidates that dealt with us. Like we give them before, the way we run our all candidate meetings, and there are going to be probably 3 to 6 of them here in the downtown area at the riding level in the next month or two. You know St. Peter's over here in Bathurst? We're going to have one over there. We're going to have one at St. Patrick's, probably at St. Bonaventure, several of them. But we have a questionnaire that we've already drafted, and we give that to the candidates in advance. And we invite them to fill it out entirely and give it back to us. And we actually have some answers. Christia Freeland gave us about 25 pages worth of answers that are posted on our website, and some of the other candidates have done this. And we're collecting it slowly, right? Some people will sign up to contribute news links and things like that. We're looking for any responsible source we can, because I don't think such a database exists. There are some groups, but not from a Catholic point of view, and it's not there yet. But one individual can't possibly do this alone, right?
Yeah, I find voting is really difficult because I have to sort through, okay, what's reliable information, and then now what do I believe, how do I line it up with the candidate? Like, it's just impossible.
It isn't. That's why I started the website. I had the same experience. Like, not only can you find reliable information about it, but they're not even talking about the issues.
Yeah.
They're talking about nonsense.
Exactly.
And so I figured, well, I'll give them these questionnaires, and if they're silly enough to fill it out, then we'll have it. But a surprising number of them actually give them back. We've only probably got about 10 or 15 at this point, which is not going to help you a lot in the coming election, but we're collecting them, right?
But I think also in those meetings, what was important was the candidates felt they had a chance to express their viewpoint without having to deal with a lot of echoing or animosity.
Yeah, our meetings are only question and answer sessions. We allow the candidates to answer in turn. Everybody has the same amount of time to answer questions. And we tell them this is not a debate. We don't want any arguing between you folks. And we're not going to allow people to hug you from the floor. And they all love it. They've actually been very happy. And they've actually mentioned, because we also allow at the end, we allow the candidates to mingle with people who want to ask specific questions. And it's gone over very well. And the candidates actually talk to each other a little bit, and they've actually thanked us for just giving them time in the same room together where they can talk to each other in a non-confrontational atmosphere.
Additional to that, if you also contact their campaign offices, that's where they'll be active prior to elections and will be willing to engage more some conversation to hear what people want to know. Aside from like the regular office, they have the separate ones, and those are the ones to contact.
Bella.
Yes, I'm not sure how to put together my question, but it touches to the social justice that was brought earlier. It is true that we are going through a lot in terms of abortions, euthanasia, etc. But I'm more as a person who didn't grow up, who was not born in Canada and then who's from another culture. The social justice that I really point out usually is the involvement of our Canadian government into wars and into involvement of governing independent or democratic countries, and what as Catholics or as the Catholic Church in Canada has been saying or doing in that spectrum. Just to bring up an example earlier that really kind of hurt me, but maybe I should, now I remember to go to confession. During the France election, one of the candidates said, and that person that usually the Catholic will cheer for, say that colonization was an exchange of culture. And I didn't hear any comments, or I might have missed any comments on that part of the Catholic spectrum in terms of bringing up like any comments, like any, because I believe it's not. And
Or that it was wrong, that the colonization was
right,
wrong.
and I do see many involvement of the Canadian government in terms of pushing the policies of abortions and the funds that go into NGOs that go into most of African countries, and the wars that they are like participating in, if either soldiers or militias, etc. But what are we saying about that?
You know, that's a really good point, Bella. Thank you. I should have brought that out more on the talk about the common good. In a democracy, we are not only responsible for what happens inside Canada, we're responsible for what our nation does outside. Unless we have been involved and had a voice and voted, we are responsible for Canada's actions in mines in South and Central America. We are responsible for what it does in Africa. We're responsible for what it does all around the world. And if we're not stepping up to the plate and having a voice in that, we're going to answer for that. It's part of what we've been given to do by God. You know, we have a responsibility. We have the ability to either act for good or for ill in the world. And we have to speak up about that, and we have to let our politicians know. We need to write letters. You need to stop this. This is hurting people, you know, and you're doing it in the name of Canada. So that's a very, very good point. Thank you. I will be sure to bring that out in the future.
Back to calling the MP's office, I work in an MP's office, and all of that data is collected. So the calls that you make are important.
Oh, good.
So just, it is like, you know, how many times they call about the Morgan, you know, pipeline, and they, so they are dataing it, and personally not always using it the way I would like them to, but they do record it, so do make your calls, but do join the Archdiocese, because there is somebody there to sort of guide you through it.
Yeah, and they can also, I think that the Office of Communications there can actually help you to make sure that your isolated comment is explicitly tied to the larger pool of comments, like Father was talking about. What is the name of the campaign? I forgot.
You sign up Sundays.
Yeah.
You can still
Yeah.
go
No, yeah.
go to the communications
Exactly.
office and sign
Yeah.
up for that.
Hopefully everybody here is signed up for that, because, you know, we can say this, you know, you can get it back to that, right?
Yeah. You can still do that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Here's
was
a-
told by an MVP, he's like, I saw your name on the list. So like, it does go to them,
Very good.
yeah.
And sometimes they look at it.
Sometimes they look at it. It depends on their staff too, right? Because sometimes the staff tend to be little gatekeepers.
But if we don't even try to participate, we're never going to be free. Well, thanks a million.